As we move into night two of the DNC, much of the Vice President and Vice President Harris's campaign proposals so far have focused on economic policies for the middle class, from a child tax credit to lowering the cost of housing. But how feasible are the policies, and if implemented, could they be helpful towards everyday Americans? And for more, let's welcome in Joe Brusuelas, RSM Chief Economist. Joe, great to have you here. First, let's lay out what really strikes a chord here from the economic agenda that we've heard thus far.
Well, what you're seeing is the left's version of economic populism as they push forward and try to split the difference or narrow the difference with Mr. Trump. You know, I think that some of these, we'll just call them proposals, but they're really messaging, ought to be taken with a big grain of salt. My sense is these are very good talking and very useful talking points that massage the erogenous zones of the Democratic Party. And in fact, some are quite popular with the public, but I just don't see many of these things actually being implemented. And I think over time, it'd be a good time if they walk some of this stuff back.
And so what would be on the chopping block in that instance if you did start to see rent control?
Rent control is a bad idea. That's always and everywhere a bad idea. And what rent control does is it creates a perverse series of incentives. You end up with less supply, and you get distortions that go on for a very long time. Now, what I do like that they proposed was building 3 million more homes. Now, using a series of tax incentives to get builders to build more starter homes. I think that's a really very strong idea. And then on the back of that, you could put forward incentives for first-time home buyers. But the policy sequence there is very, very important. You got to build the supply and then provide the incentive. So that's a positive, right? And then second, they need to clarify what exactly they mean by price gouging, right? My sense is corporate price gouging did not cause inflation. The inflation price shock that we had was largely caused by shutting down supply chains during 2020 and in the pandemic. And we're 2024 and we're just back to price stability now. Now, if they intend to use antitrust to deal with distortions or serious deviations from long-term selling prices, that's perfectly legitimate. If it's in the grocery sector, also legitimate. But a ban on price gouging, well, you know, we really want to know what that is. Now, there's 40 states, including where I live in Texas, that have those. So it's not like these are out of the realm of the ordinary. But when a possible future president of the United States talks about a ban on price gouging, it requires a lot more transparency, and we need to see the details and exactly what that means. So we take a step back. What I think is it's the DNC. It's their convention. This is more messaging than reality. I think we really won't get much actual detail out of this election from either candidate, because to be honest with you, this election doesn't look to me like it's about the economy. It's about some other things.
And Joe, while we have you here, one of the huge things that I think for both candidates, anybody who's watching the DNC or did watch the RNC a few weeks back is probably right to ask, how are some of these things going to get paid for? Is there any kind of clear consensus around how some of the initiatives that both candidates have put forward would ultimately get paid for?
There's absolutely no consensus on this. Let me let you in on a little secret. Anybody goes to Washington, talks to policymakers, takes what we do in the economy and finance seriously. You know what the really big Super Bowl that's setting up next year? It's the tax cliff. It's the end of the year expiration of 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That's literally the single biggest thing that's being talked about in Washington. Both parties are preparing ideas around that. And what I'm seeing out of the DNC or the RNC have no bearing on that. That's where it's really going to be at. And what will happen, my sense is, midsummer next year, about a year from now, we'll just see the etchings of the serious discussion of what the successor to the 2017 TCJA is going to be. And until then, it's just going to be more talk than reality.
Joe, while we have you, earlier this morning on Yahoo Finance's Morning Brief, Ahmed Riesco, who is the Insignio Chief Investment Officer, spoke with us about the health of the consumer, and I'd love to get your reaction on the other end.
we know that the U.S. consumer is doing okay, but the U.S. consumer is doing okay because they still have a job. The second that the employment market flips from one of surplus to one of deficit, which is something that we're rapidly nearing, we think the U.S. consumer, unfortunately, will falter.
And so, Joe, I'm just going to get your reaction here. I mean, you and I have spoken on a very optimistic tone about the strength in the employment situation for many readings at this juncture. I want to get your reaction to what Ahmed had to say about if we did see a flip in the employment and the labor market.
I'm not sure what economy he's looking at because the American economy is now getting ready to flip. The unemployment rate's 4.3%. We're coming off unusual lows following, well, a very unusual time, the pandemic. So a lot of the rules of thumb that some of these so-called forward-looking investors use aren't really going to work this time because the economy is in a very different place. You know, we needed to slow hiring down in order to get return to price stability. We slowed hiring down. Price stability has returned to the U.S. economy. Federal Reserve is getting ready to cut rates, both to protect and preserve the soft landing, put a floor under the labor market, right? And because the policy rate's too tight for an economy with a 2.5% interest rate. I would strongly disagree with what your guest said about the state, the condition, and the likely forward path of the American economy and the labor market.